Hi, I'm Matt from Touratech, and today I'm going to show you how to install these Touratech cartridges in your Ducati Desert X. We've got the bike here, we're pretty excited about it, and this cartridge kit will dramatically improve the handling on the front end of the bike. It's a simple drop-in installation, but to many people it might be a little intimidating getting into your forks, so we're hoping this video will help alleviate any of those concerns, or perhaps convince you to take it to professional for installation. These are the tools you'll need for this installation. Okay, I've got the bike up on a stand here in order to get the front wheel off the ground. So the first thing we're going to do is pull the front wheel and anything attached to the forks. I'm going to start by removing the brake calipers with a 8mm hex driver. And we'll need to go around and do the other side as well. This allows the front wheel to drop off. Next, we're going to take a 30mm socket and loosen the front axle bolt. We don't want to take it out quite yet. After that, we'll use a 6mm hex to loosen but not remove all the pinch bolts. There's 4 of them on the axle. And now we should be able to just remove this axle nut, make sure the spacer stays with it, and then take a little weight off the wheel and pull that axle through. The wheel will come right off. The last things connected to the forks are the fender and the speed sensor. We're going to use a 5mm hex driver to remove the 3 bolts on each side connecting the fender and the 1 bolt holding the speed sensor in. Now that the front fender's off, I'm going to go ahead and remove these fender mount brackets using a 4mm hex, just to get them out of the way. This isn't entirely necessary, but it allows you to keep the speed sensor wire mounted in its clamps, and it kind of just gets this out of the way while you're working on the forks. Before we take the forks off the bike, there's a couple things that are easier to loosen while they're mounted than when they're off the bike. So the first thing is the bottom bolt that holds the cartridge into the fork. We're going to use a long 8mm hex bit and go up underneath. And I already loosened these before, but it takes a little bit of a force while holding this. But you want to just loosen them just a little bit. If you loosen them too much, then oil will start coming out. But you want it to be loose enough you can get it with your hand later. We're going to do both sides just a little bit, and that's good. The next thing we're going to do is go up top and loosen the fork caps. Before I do any spring swaps or cartridge swaps or anything, I always like to back out the adjusters, the damping adjusters and the preload adjusters, just so there's less pressure on the spring and all the passages are free flowing and the oil can make its way out. So go ahead and do that on both sides. It's a flat bladed screwdriver for the damping and a 14mm wrench for the preload. When you're backing these adjusters out, you'll know when to stop because it'll be a real light stop. Just don't force it past that. Next thing I'm going to do is loosen the upper triple clamp bolts with a 5mm hex. We're going to loosen the uppers but not the lowers, and that way we can get this cap unscrewed and the lowers will hold tension on the fork. To loosen the fork cap, we're going to use a 24mm box end wrench on the large nut on the top. We're going to hold the handlebars and just give it a little bit of force. We don't want to unscrew it all the way, but just get it so that we can loosen it by hand later. And now it's time to drop the forks out of the triple clamps. Okay, now that everything is loosened up top, I'm going to loosen these lower triple clamp bolts with a 6mm hex driver. Once these are loose, we'll go ahead and try to slide this fork tube out. Sometimes it takes a little bit of a shimmy, sometimes a twisting back and forth motion. There we go. We'll set this aside. And move on to the other leg. Same thing, 6mm hex. Loosen the lower triple clamp bolts. We'll just twist to break that loose. Now we've got the forks off and ready to swap the cartridges. Now that the forks are off the bike, I've got them in our suspension room here. You can see it's a tight space, but it's really important to do this somewhere where you can spill oil, make a mess. You'll notice I'm wearing rubber gloves, and I've got lots of towels handy because this is the dirty part of the job. First, I'm going to drain as much oil as I can out of the top of the fork tube to make it a little bit cleaner when we do the bottom end. So I'm going to take a 24mm wrench and I'm just going to loosen this cap the rest of the way. This is the cap that we loosened up before when it was clamped into the bike. So we'll unthread this. And the fork tube will slide a little bit. Now you can see the spring on the top of the cartridge. And I'm just going to take this and pour it into an oil drain pan. There's quite a bit of oil in this because it's an open cartridge. Once we've got most of the oil out of there, I'm just going to screw this back in temporarily while we do the bottom end, and we'll drain the rest of the oil out of the bottom. The next step is going to be to remove the bottom mounting bolt for the cartridge. This uses an 8mm hex, and it can be kind of tricky. Even though we loosened it up on the bike, this tends to spin as you try to loosen it. So one thing that I've found works really well is an impact wrench and an 8mm driver. And that way it can just zap it out really quick without spinning it at all. So we'll give that a shot. We'll do it over the pan because this can get messy. And we'll hold the bottom part of the fork. There you go. We'll just let that drain a little bit. Make sure we retain the bolt. There's also a copper crush washer in there that we'll pry out later. Make sure it doesn't drop into the oil pan. Now that the bottom bolt is removed, we should be able to just unscrew this top cap and pull the whole cartridge out as one piece. And there it is, the stock cartridge. Pretty messy, so I have somewhere to put it down. I'll go ahead and set that in an oil pan. But you can see there's the entire internals of the fork, and we're going to replace all of this with the Touratech unit. You can see the huge difference between these cartridges. Here's the stock Ducati cartridge, and here's the Touratech Extreme cartridge. This is a much more substantial cartridge. It's a closed cartridge, so it has its own nitrogen charge and internal oil, which is going to give you way better performance and longevity. It's just off-road and on-road is going to be a much better unit. There's a little bit of prep work we need to do to the Touratech cartridge before we install it. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the spring. To do that, we need this handy 15mm tool that comes with the cartridge, and then we need another 15mm open end wrench to hold the bottom. So what I'm going to do is compress the spring a little bit just to get it onto this bottom fitting. This can be a bit tricky sometimes. There we go. And then I'm going to take this 15 and I'm just going to break them apart. And sometimes it takes a little bit of work, and then we're done. So now this will thread off. And we'll be able to pick the spring up right off the top. There's a couple preload spacers in here too, so make sure you keep track of these. Now we can pull this wrench out and pull the spring off the cartridge. Now that the spring's off the cartridge, we can drop the cartridge into the fork leg. One thing you always need to pay attention to is that you're working on one leg at a time. That's why you only see me having one of these apart, because there's a rebound leg and a compression leg. I'm working on the compression leg right now, so I just made sure that the cartridge that I put in says compression on the top cap, and the cartridge that I took out said the same. It's easy to keep track of that way. So now that this is in, we need to put our bottom bolt with the crush washer into the bottom, and that's what's going to fasten this in. So we'll tip this up. I'll show you where that goes. Like that. I'm going to grab my 8mm tool here and get that started. Sometimes it can take a little finagling to get that going. So one hand on the cartridge to hold it down, and one hand screwing in the top. And now that we've got that bolt started on the bottom end, we'll use our ratchet to torque it. We won't use an impact on this because we're dealing with delicate threads. So you want to hold the bottom end of the fork and just give it a nice wrist tightness there. It's got a crush washer on it that'll help seal. So the reason we took the spring out is because when you are setting the air gap or the oil level in the fork, the spring needs to be removed. The number that they give you in the manual is with the spring out. So best way to measure air gap or oil level is with a tool like this. This is made by Motion Pro. You can make something like this on your own at home, but really this is worth the money. You can buy it from Touratech. So in order to get this to fit on here, I'm actually going to take this black plastic part off real quick. If you use your own tool, you may not have to do this, but it's easy enough, and it allows that measuring device to slip over the top there. So we're going to use the 15 weight fork oil that the kit came with. And I'm just going to fill this up. You'll notice that the fork is bottomed out. And I like to just fill this up until it's about level with the top of the fork tube. Now that I've got this filled with the oil, almost level to the top, I'm just going to cycle it through a little bit, burp all the air bubbles out, and you can look down in and see the bubbles come out. So just do a few cycles like this, just to make sure oil's everywhere it needs to be and you get an accurate oil level set. Then I take my oil level tool. It's already set to 95 millimeters, which is what the manual says. And I'm just going to suck the oil out. One of these things that's hard to do with oily hands. But I'm going to suck oil out with a syringe until it sucks dry, which means the oil is set 95 millimeters down from the fork tube top. You're using a lot thicker weight oil in a closed cartridge fork because all it's doing is lubricating the sliders instead of controlling your damping. So that thick viscosity oil is pretty hard to pull through this little tube. But you'll get a lot better longevity on your fork internals this way. There we go. So now we're at 95 millimeters. You take all this off and your oil level is set. Now I'm going to reassemble the top of the damping rod, all the pieces that I took off to get this on, and then we'll be ready to put the spring back on. Spring just drops right in over everything. And then we'll remember to have all of our spacers in here, and this fork cap just goes right on top. You'll need to compress the spring a little bit and then just thread this fork cap on. Should go pretty easy at first, and then we'll need to hold the bottom with a wrench as soon as it starts to get tight. So now I'll take my 15 millimeter open end wrench and I'll stick it back on the bottom here, and then I'll use my included 15 millimeter wrench up here, and I'll use that to tighten this the rest of the way. You never want to use too tight of Torx on these things. It's aluminum, it's fine thread, and so it's not like working on your pickup truck. This is more gentle stuff you're working with. So just snug. That's good. Okay, your fork cap's on now. Pull this off. Now we can slide this up and thread the cap into it. And to do that, we've got the other end of this tool that's included is a pin spanner, and that just goes on here. And that just gets tightened into the tube. You can snug it up, and we can always tighten it more when it's installed on the bike. So now we have the cartridge installed in the fork leg, we've got the bottom bolt in, and we've got the top tightened, and our air gap set, and everything's ready to go back on the bike. Installing the cartridges in the fork legs is the same for both the compression and the rebound side, so I went ahead and did the other leg, and now both fork legs are ready to install. First thing we're going to do is make sure that we're installing the right side, on the right side of the bike. Easy way to tell that is that the compression leg has the speed sensor fitting on the bottom of it. So this one's going to go in first. They can be tricky. We're just going to kind of fit it in there and give it a little side-to-side twisting. Sometimes it helps to have somebody hold the handlebars a little bit steady when you do it. There we go. Check up there. Got a little bit more to go. Okay, so that's good for now. We'll do the other side, same way. All right, and then we'll go up top and we'll make sure that we've got the forks high enough in the triple clamps. We want to make sure that these fork caps sit the same distance above the triple tree on both sides. The Ducati service manual says 11.4 millimeters or 0.45 inches. So you want to just check those using a scale or something else and make sure they're the same. And you'll probably have to shimmy them up or down a little bit either way until they get about like this. Again, it's 11.4 millimeters or 0.45 inches above this triple clamp. Next, we're going to snug down the bottom bolts a little bit and tighten these caps, and then we'll torque everything down. I'm going to snug up these lower triple clamp bolts just hand tight so that we can re-torque the top caps and that bottom bolt. And this just holds the fork in place while we do that. So we'll grab this wrench that comes with the kit and we'll just snug these up a little bit more, make sure we got them nice and snug. It's easier to do this now than when you're holding them in your hand. Okay, those are good. Next thing we'll do is the same for that lower bolt. So we're going to take that 8 millimeter hex again and just make sure that these are tight. They don't have to be real tight, just snug. Okay, those are good. So now we'll torque everything down to the factory specs, which is 16 Newton meters for the lower bolts and 10 Newton meters for the uppers. And I'm going to use a torque wrench, and you just want to torque them back and forth. They kind of work together. So I usually go up, down, as I'm torquing them, just to make sure. We'll readjust this to 10 Newton meters, which isn't very much, so you got to be careful with these bolts. And we'll do these upper ones. Okay, those are all torqued. We're ready to put the front wheel and fender and brake calipers and everything else on. Next step is going to be to reinstall the fender brackets, remount the speed sensor, and then remount the lower fender. We have to do all this before we put the front wheel on. Next thing we're going to do is put the front wheel on and get the axle all tightened up. I've got my wheel ready to go here. I've made sure I've got the spacer still in the wheel on the clutch side. I'm just going to raise this into place, put the axle in from the throttle side, and then I'm going to push it in until this end is flush with the outside of the fork. Just like that. Got the axle nut here. I've made sure that I've got this washer on it. I'm gonna go ahead and thread this on until it's flush on there, and that'll pull the axle into exactly where it needs to be. Once I've got that hand tight, I'm going to snug up the pinch bolts just on this side, and that's going to allow us to torque this to the factory spec of 63 Newton meters or 46 foot-pounds. And we'll do that with a 30 millimeter socket. Okay. Now we can loosen these back up and we'll do the proper torquing method on the pinch bolts next. Now we're going to put the calipers back on, which requires putting them on the disc and then inserting the bolts. And these get torqued to 45 Newton meters or about 33 foot-pounds of torque. Same goes for the other side. So I've got the bike off of the lift now, and I've left the lower axle pinch bolts loose so that we could center the axle and the axle clamps. And to do that, what we're going to do is just hold the front brake and pump up and down on the forks a couple times, and that gets the axle where it needs to be. And then we're going to go and tighten the pinch bolts to 19 Newton meters in an alternating pattern on both sides. As you can see, the Touratech Extreme cartridges are a drop-in system, but there's a lot of steps to get them into the bike. There's no modifications necessary, so this is something that your average mechanic could do, any shop, anybody with a little bit of mechanical ability, but it's not for the faint of heart. I hope the video has helped explain it all. And the next step is to adjust the forks, which is the fun step. You get to go out and ride it, play with the compression and rebound and preload settings. And on the Touratech USA website, we have a great blog that explains what each clicker does and how to adjust it. And that's my favorite part of it, is going out and riding and really dialing it in and seeing what this does and what it transformed the bike into.